Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy to welcome you all to Ifao. I'm Antoinette Ferrand, scientific member at Ifao and historian in modern Egypt. I'm thrilled to welcome today's speaker, Amr Khairy, and I'm the more delighted to welcome you today because we met in this very room when we were in the final race to submit our PhD, so it means a lot. Since then, Amr Khairy holds a PhD in human ecology in Lund University. He researches social and cultural history of the energy and technology in the 19th century Egypt from a very specific interdisciplinary background that he will present today. He is currently a postdoctoral researcher at Ifao and CEDEJ, and he's working on several projects aside, including solar energy for agriculture in contemporary arid environments and the conceptual history of macroeconomics and engineering in Egypt. Today, he will present his book project based on his PhD thesis entitled Egypt Ignited, How Steam Power Arrived on the Nile and Integrated Egypt into Industrial Capitalism in the 19th Century. And about this social history of the arrival of the fuel energy in Egypt, Amr, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Antoinette. Thank you for the introduction. It's a great privilege to be presenting at FAO and to be here today with Antoinette Ferrand as my discussant. We share the same workspace, but it's really a privilege to work with all of you and to be presenting at FAO. So this project started as it's now a book project. So a little bit about that. I submitted the book manuscript in December 2024, and I'm still waiting on reviews and feedback based on a contract with the publisher, who is based in the UK, a trade publisher, not an academic publisher. But they also tend to publish works done by academics, especially history. This project stems from my PhD thesis, which was concluded in November 2023. And I'm not going to speak about how the thesis turned it into a book, but I wanted to speak a little bit about the interdisciplinary space in which this book seeks to contribute. So the narrow discipline, I would say, would be history of technology in Egypt. It had been a gap for a while, which has been little noticed, but it was at least highlighted by two historians of Egypt many decades ago. Roger Owen, for example, in 1988, in one of his fascinating articles, The Middle Eastern Factory as a Site for the Application of New Technology in the 19th Century, he talked a little bit about few industries and factories across the Arab region, including in Egypt and Lebanon, and he had these inspiring questions. Why the machines were introduced in the first place to the factories, and why some technologies of production developed while others remained stagnant. And I think this kind of question remained unanswered for a very long time. But at least there was now this space to ask about these questions and include them in historical inquiry. Joel Benin said something like it. He's one of the most prominent historians of labor working on Egypt and the Middle East. But I didn't come from the long tradition of doing modern Egypt history. I wasn't really trained as a historian. My department, where I did the PhD, is human geography at Lund University. Within that, there is this little unit, human ecology, and they define human ecology as the relationships between nature and society, or nature and human existence, human and non-human. So anything related to geography, but also geography in the interplay between the human and non-human. And within that little unit, there is this bucket of inquiry into environmental history. So I started this project by just wishing to contribute to a debate that was going on at the department at the time in 2019 about the thing they call the energy transition. How is the world going to move on from fossil fuels to renewables towards a better future to avoid the pitfalls of global warming and so on and so forth. And one of the inspiring inquiries into this kind of question looked actually at the history of the fossil economy. A question asked by Andreas Malm, who later became my supervisor, who lit the fire. This is the title of an article he have written several years ago, and by this he was asking who lit the fire of global warming? How did global warming happen? How can we seek to understand it as a historical phenomena that unfolded in time and is still doing so? Because the particles, the carbon particles in the atmosphere at the moment, creating the greenhouse effect, many of them came up to the atmosphere at the time of the Industrial Revolution 200 years ago. So we literally have history intervening in the physics of the atmosphere itself. So history should contribute to understanding what is global warming. So to cut the long story short, I wanted to do a social history of what historians now call, and other social scientists, Anthropocene, the age, the geological age of the humans, or Capitalocene, the geological age of capitalism, depending on what philosophical, theoretical tools you're asking your question is. So to reformulate that in the context of Egypt, the question of energy transition moving into steam power or fossil fuel and the fossil economy in the 19th century, it's not an abstract question about energy per se anymore. It's about the social the social spaces that the question of energy transition occupied across the years. It becomes something like this statement: the deployment of fossil energy in Egypt in conjunction with intensified corvée labor or indentured labor, unfree labor, monoculture, the agriculture of single crops across huge swaths of land, and changing production technologies and their motive power and fuels. Or, in a word, the socio-ecological history of energy, the social and environmental history of energy historicized together, society and nature. To put it in a research question, it looked like this: how did fossil fuel technology find its way to Egypt on its way to global dominance? So by asking this question, it becomes about Egypt's role in the Industrial Revolution, Egypt's place in the rise of global warming from the 19th century. So in a way, it's looking at the Industrial Revolution, looking at global warming from the point of view of a country or a region in the global south versus the more accustomed way of looking at it. Industrial Revolution belongs to England and Europe at large in later decades, which is kind of the view I wanted to change with this research. So as I said, I'm not, I wasn't, and I'm not sure yet if I'm a historian of Egypt, because I come from, different traditions. These are just people and books and names of disciplines and sub-disciplines that had some influence on me. Which, yes, I love this. So this book is by far the thing that had the most influence on me, by Andreas Malm, my supervisor, Fossil Capital. Here in this volume published around 2016, he proposes a radically different view on the Industrial Revolution, and he says things like global warming, carbon particles, physics, and the atmosphere are related in so many different ways to the questions of economic history. This is his supervisor, or as we call him, our big sheikh, Andreas Alfornborg. He's an anthropologist. He did his field work on North America. But then in later decades, he created the division where I was doing the PhD, human ecology, and he became, later on, he belonged to the tradition of world system theory, and he has some unique and different thoughts and theories about environmental history and global history. Another influence that came later on is the shock of the Anthropocene by the two French philosophers, Christophe Bonnewill and Jean-Baptiste Frizos. It's a sweeping survey of ways to look at the question of humans in nature over the last 2 or 3 centuries. Disciplines, books. So, for example, one of the most important theoretical tenets of my work belongs to environmental philosophy. The question of how to understand nature in relation to society, or the human in relation to the non-human. I will get there in a moment. One other thing which I didn't expect to get into when I started working on this book or on the thesis on which it's based is the history of industrial architecture. We will see how is that related later in the presentation. So about theory, the first premises I stand on, I guess, is an epistemological question. It's not theory. It's, I mean, it's more than a broader position. It's this idea that history should always come before theory. So before you have some theoretical construct in your mind, then you try to explain history by using that theoretical construction. Perhaps it's better if you let history speak itself and then try to ground your theory in whatever patterns and questions come up from the history itself. One of the most important theoretical tools I really use empirically across the book is the question of nature-society combinations. It's a huge question in environmental philosophy, how to understand the humans in relation to nature. So, for example, some people would say nature doesn't exist. It's a construct of the human mind, because the way we speak about nature, when we talk about a forest, about a river, that's all there is to it, because we cannot know what is reality. We only know how we speak about reality. Constructivism in our constructivism. Another trend would be new materialism, which gives much more agency to nature itself and tries to theorize how non-human beings and things can influence human living, and by extension, how we should look at social science and history at large. But this position comes from nature-society combination, says something different. Nature and society exist in dialectical combinations, where nature can impact society in some ways, and then society strikes back at nature in some ways. The biggest example, of course, is climate change itself. So society impacted nature by rising carbon emissions. So nature strike back, nature changed, and we are now living in a increasingly warmer planet. So nature strikes back at humanity by more and more natural disasters. But nature doesn't have agency. It doesn't do things because it has the will to do things. It's the nature of agency, human agency and non-human agency is different. This is a very important point. Another point I use for the book is the question of, let's call it landscape thinking. Let's look at any phenomena or any question as a landscape where two things can coexist for a while. For example, there is this age-old question of pre-capitalism and capitalism, and the question of the modes of production, Asiatic modes of production, capitalist mode of production, pre-capitalist mode of production. And it went on and on and on, this kind of question. In the 60s, between the 40s and the 70s, 80s. And it's generally known as the transition question. It had occupied historians and philosophers for too long. So I try to avoid all that thinking about what is pre-capitalist and what is capitalist in the kind of economic technological history I am trying to write, and instead acknowledge that we have a landscape where pre-capitalist and capitalist elements coexist for a while until after some time it could be more capitalist than pre-capitalist. This idea really comes squarely from Peter Hill, a Middle East historian. I would say that maybe I should go faster. Other theoretical ideas can become clearer as I speak about the book itself. So the book, Egypt Ignited, How Steam Power Arrived on the Nile and Integrated Egypt into Industrial Capitalism. And I cover the period from the 1820s to the 1870s, roughly what we can look at as pre-colonial Egypt, pre-colonial modern Egypt. Egypt in the 19th century, but before British occupation in 1882. So the book is in 3 parts. 2 of them are much, much longer than the third one, which is just one chapter, one short chapter. Part 1 looks at the years of Muhammad Ali Pasha from the 1820s. He ruled the country from 1805, but I look at Muhammad Ali starting the 1820s when industrial activities really picked up pace. From the 1820s to the early 1860s. So Muhammad Ali, Abbas Pasha, and Said Pasha. Part 2 is about the years of Khedive Ismail, not all of his reign, roughly the 1860s and the early 1870s. And what I do in these 2 parts, part 1 and 2, the frustrated empire and combustible carbon, I do a synthesis of the history of steam power and technology and the transition from animal power to fossil fuels in Egypt across all these decades. So it's really a simple chronological story, and I think I have written it in all these chapters, 10 chapters, because it's nobody have done it before to collect this kind of basic history of how steam power came to Egypt. The last section, capitalism and its afarit. It's kind of a cultural history or conceptual history, or not really history. It's a little bit of a commentary on what does this history means in terms of 2 questions. How the elite in Egypt understood steam power, and I'm talking about economic thinking. Rifat Tahtawi, for example, started to think about and talk about the whole idea of industrialization. And when he didn't use the word صناعة, he used the word industria. He transliterated industrie from French into Arabic because الصناعة in Arabic at the time didn't mean anything really. It didn't mean, factories and these things. And he connected it very strongly to some ideas, including capitalism, colonialism, and the global trade. So industria, meant all these things. On the other hand, how the lay people, the peasants in rural areas in Egypt understood the steam engines. And they had very good reasons to think about the steam engine as infested with afarit, creatures of the underworld. I'm afraid I will not have time to speak about this last chapter unless it comes up through questions. So what remains in my presentation now is to speak briefly about some of the chapters. So very broadly, what I do in part 1, after the introduction, in chapter 2, I'm sorry, I call it chapter 2 because I call the introduction chapter 1. So chapter 2 is the first thing in the book. I do a quick survey of the factories built by Muhammad Ali, because a lot of people still think that Egypt have been a modern state, an industrialized country built by the hands of Muhammad Ali Pasha. In this magazine from the 1920s, the title goes, Muhammad Ali is the creator of modern Egypt. But what I say in that first chapter is that while he created and brought modernity in several ways, maybe he didn't do that to the factories, because his factories were actually run by cattle, not by steam engines. So we have modern machinery in the factories, textile machinery, for example, factories for building cannons, for foundries, for casting iron and doing great things. But the great majority of these industries were run by cattle power. Not because Muhammad Ali didn't know that he needed coal, but because they didn't have any coal to run the steam engines. And coal imported from other countries, namely England at the time, was very expensive to make the production of this factory economically feasible. So when I write about Muhammad Ali, I mostly write about his prospecting for coal, how he kept looking for coal to run the modern machines he had in his factories, including very few steam engines he brought from England and France. So, for example, we get exposed to a story or an argument that says that maybe Muhammad Ali invaded Syria in the 1830s because he wanted to put his hands on the Syrian coal mines in Mount Lebanon. I'm speaking about Greater Syria at the time. But it turns out that the coal quality in those coal mines in Mount Lebanon quality was really inferior. So it didn't bring him any good coal anyway. So the story goes like this. Muhammad Ali's search for coal, his hybrid factory system where we have animals running very modern machines. And then the question that really brings up what I mean by nature-society combination as a theory is the question of the land redistribution in Egypt, agricultural land redistribution in Egypt in the 1830s and 40s in relation to an episodic. In the year 1840, Muhammad Ali redistributed land from the peasants to people in his family and to employees, senior employees in the state. Historians have talked about this for long. Roger Owen, for example, said that Muhammad Ali redistributed land in the 1840s and he went into the political economy of it. But he also says, as a side note, that around these years, there was a big cattle plague, an epizootic that ravaged Egypt. All the cattle in Egypt died suddenly in 1840, and he talks about it as a natural disaster. So nature and society. So a little digging from the point of view of this question of environmental philosophy, how is nature and society combined and changing each other, shows that actually maybe the redistribution of land itself had caused the cattle episodic. How was that? How did that happen? A little digging shows that when the land was redistributed in the year 1840, the new owners of the land wanted to make their lands productive, and they were now owners of big units of land. So instead, before it was run by households, each household working a little piece of land, so human energy was effective in making the land productive. But all of a sudden, someone owns 1,000 hectares, for example. That person needs to bring other forms of energy to make the land productive. Not enough people in the country to do the manual labors themselves. So what they did, they imported all of a sudden a huge amount of cattle from overseas. And these animals come in congregated in huge numbers in ships across the Mediterranean. And in this close proximity, any disease can spread really fast. So this is what really happened. Once they touched land in Alexandria, many of the cattle that came to Egypt in the year 1840 were infected by something called the cattle murrain. It's I think the virus. And they spread the disease across Egypt. So in a way, there is evidence that a human activity, large human activity on such a scale, redistribution of land can cause some natural disaster. And it kind of reminds us of the question of the bigger question of global warming, how humans have did something to nature in the form of global warming. So maybe this is like a micro example or case of it. So this is what I meant by nature-society combination, and it's kind of the mode of analysis that runs across the book in later chapters as well. So all the cattle died in Egypt, including the cattle that were running the factories. And Muhammad Ali's industrial program collapsed around the mid-1840s because the cattle running the factories died when they were infected by the cattle who came to run the redistributed land. This is the kind of causality chains I try to get myself involved in and try to analyze. Very quickly, across the later years, after Muhammad Ali died, from the late 1840s to 1863, this is actually when steam technology came to Egypt. So Muhammad Ali tried to build an empire, and he tried to be a rival of England, but England didn't give him any call. England didn't allow it to didn't allow Muhammad Ali to possess steam technology, because technology, as historians of technology would say, whoever possesses the most advanced technologies that gives them power will hold the monopoly to the technology that gives them this advantage. So nobody would willingly part with steam technology because it leads to economic development or growth somewhere else in the world. So Muhammad Ali was trying to compete with England, and he failed miserably. Only after Muhammad Ali failed, Egypt advanced into the age of steam technology, which is you see the contradiction. You become advanced after you are defeated. And for very different reasons. It didn't happen because England is an evil country or because capitalism is bad. Or it's not about that. It's about big structural things and also contingencies that happen just because it happens. Like, for example, in the 1850s, the upkeeping of the irrigation system across the delta suffered a lot because it wasn't maintained as good as it was maintained anymore in the age of Muhammad Ali. So what was the quick fix for fixing the canals, the irrigation canals? This very weird looking machine. It's called the mud machine. It was a prototype, not a real thing. It didn't really take off in the 1850s. This is a design drawn by an engineer called Max Eit. We will meet him very briefly in a minute. It was a prototype for a digger that goes into a canal or a river and starts dredging, bring up mud and throw it outside so the canal will be maintained very quickly. But why was it a prototype? As you see, it has so many pulleys and belts, and it has some wood parts, and it works in the outdoors. It's movable. It looks like a car. At a time when a car was out of the question, it might also look like a tank or something. So it was so big and so experimental, it failed. But Abbas Pasha, the man in the middle who was ruling Egypt in the early 1850s, he might have been the one who brought that mud machine. He brought a few of them to dredge the Mahmoudiyya Canal that extended between Alexandria and Egypt because it was an important navigation route. It was the highway between Alexandria and Cairo at the time. So they needed a quick fix to make that canal keep working as a navigation canal. So here's why steam power came in the 1850s. Just an example. By the late 1850s and the early 1860s, it was a time of Said Pasha. This is, I think, an actual photograph. So Said Pasha, he was very unlike his predecessor, Abbas. Abbas, he was said to be a very reactionary man. He didn't like foreigners. He expelled a lot of foreigners living in Egypt, but he was in fact the guy who brought steam technology advancement and new technology to the country. But he's said to be very close-minded and such things. Said was very open to Europe. he changed the tax regime into monetized taxation. All of a sudden, everybody paying tax to the state, instead of paying it in kind, in grains, for example, they have to pay it in cash. And let's remember, it was a time, the mid-19th century, after Muhammad Ali's decades, it was a time when a lot of people didn't see coins or paper money in their hands across their lives. People living in rural areas, for example. And this hadn't been the situation in Egypt across history, of course. I mean, in Fatimid Egypt, 1,000 years ago, peasants in Fayoum, in Aswan, in Kos, for example, were dealing in money, but it wasn't the case in 19th century Egypt. So all of a sudden, Said introduces money taxation, and it follows from that. It was also a time when a lot of people were growing cotton because cotton prices were rising, and that across, because of a causality chain I'm not going to get into, led to the proliferation of debts on many scales. What do I mean by fractal debts? The small farmers who were growing cotton on half an acre or an acre or two needed to take loans in order to change from growing rice, for example, to growing cotton, because cotton was winning and they wanted cash in their hands to pay the tax, to pay the state tax. So they took loans from what historians call usurers, people who informally give you a loan with a huge interest. Why is it fractal? Because Said Basha decided that maybe instead of the usurers who are giving the peasants loans with a huge interest, maybe he can invite the British to start a bank in Egypt. So he sent to the Manchester Cotton Supply Association around the 1862, and he invited them to come to the country and discuss together the idea of a cotton ban. Give the peasants loans with low interest, so the peasants will grow cotton. Manchester Cotton Supply Association will then take that cotton and turn it into textiles over in England. But when the Manchester Supply Association director came to meet Said Basha, he actually said, you know what, maybe it shouldn't be a bank. Maybe we should discuss a British cotton company, like the one we have in India. So it turns out that Manchester Cotton Supply Association might have been thinking about colonizing Egypt in the year 1863 along the lines of what was happening in India for a very long time before that, but that never happened. The cotton company never materialized because things changed quite dramatically when Ismail Basha came to power in January 1863. So this is Khedive Ismail. He came to power in 1863, and once he came, a very curious thing happened. Another cattle moraine, another cattle episodic happened in Egypt in the spring of 1863, like the one that happened in 1840. But while the cattle episodic that happened in 1840 led to the collapse of Muhammad Ali's industrialization project, because all the cattle in the factories died all of a sudden, this one spurred the cattle exotic from 1863. It spurred the quick transition into steam technology. Because at the time, over in England, there was this new invention, the locomobile, or the locomotive that works in the farm. And that thing is basically a train locomotive, a small one, and you get some belts and some other appliances attached to it, and it becomes able to blow the land and do agricultural work on the farm instead of animals. So an animal of steel and steam instead of the cattle that tend to catch a virus and die every now and then. So as we can imagine, Khalid Ismail, when he came to power, he was really hungry for expanding his land positions and his economic power generally. So he started importing huge amounts of that automobile from England, to the extent that by the year 1863-64, Egypt was importing what amounted to 20% of all steam engines exported by England anywhere in the world. So for every 5 steam engines exported from England across the world, one of them was coming to Egypt. Part two is where I speak about the very quick transition to steam power in the 1860s, with a mounting degree of dependency on the British Empire and the British economy, and by extension, as a economy and power of other European countries. It was a time when we have seen the quick and very expanded adoption of two commodities, sugar and before it, cotton. In the early 1860s, a cotton famine hit the world because of the American Civil War, because the American South was producing a huge amount of cotton for textile and spinning factories across Europe. That supply suddenly stopped. Cotton prices were multiplied by 5. Khedive Ismail and Egyptian landowners decided that they want to invest in cotton, so they bought a lot of those locomobiles, and Egypt suddenly transitioned into a country that irrigates its land by steam power more than it does by animal power. So an actual statistically proven energy transition to steam power happened around the year early 1870s until the year 1873. Why do I have the pictures of these two other gentlemen? The man in the middle is Prince Halim, Ismail's uncle. He learned at the Polytechnique in Paris, and he really liked steam technology and machinery. He had an experimental farm in Shobra, inherited from his father, Muhammad Ali, where he imported and used lots and lots of steam machinery, even before anybody felt the need to use steam technology. He just liked the machines, perhaps, or maybe he was trying to see how they are going to be used in an economically productive way. And the man to the right, Max Ait, I don't think he was discussed before in any history of Egypt, except being mentioned in passing by in a monograph by David Landes from the 1950s. He was the guy who brought fossil economy to Egypt, to put it simply and bluntly. Max Ait was German, and he was working for one of the most important locomobile producers in London. And he was the agent of one of those big producers of machinery that Egypt imported. And he was also the chief engineer of Prince Halim, the man in the middle. In the book, I tell the story of how a power struggle happened between Ismail and his uncle, Prince Halim. So he accused him of organizing a coup attempt against him, trying to assassinate him in the late 1860s. He was banished outside Egypt. And then at some point, Khedive Ismail confiscated and bought all of his lands and machines and factories. So there is a little bit of going back and forth and a lot of details about the late 1860s and political power and, conspiracy balances, this kind of thing in one of the chapters in that part 2. I will have to go very quickly now. But I also said at the beginning, it's a socio-ecological history. So I don't just follow the transition to energy. I also try to see how it impacted society at large. So for example, most of the new steam technologies that came to Egypt in the 1860s was directed at the Delta, because cotton was being grown in the Delta. But something curious happened in Upper Egypt at the time. In the year 1864, in a village called Kau, and some villages around it, a huge uprising erupted. We have evidence, very scattered, that it was a very big event. The peasants rose up in that place between Asyut and Girga. Thousands rose up in revolution, and they confiscated the cargo from ships and steamers carrying sugar and other commodities going from the sugar factories in the south uh, to Cairo and further on to Europe. It was a violent uprising. Khedive Ismail went there. He deployed around 10,000 soldiers. He brought with him cannons, and the whole situation was resolved within very few days, and thousands of people died. This is an illustration by a German illustrator, Karl Wilhelm Gens, after the massacres that happened at the time. These are some members of a Bedouin tribe that was working with Khedive Ismail at the time, whom he sent into the eastern desert to bring the rebels who fled and just fleeing for their life. So I mean, when I first saw that illustration, it's really powerful. But why I'm using it here now is because I wanted to show what it means to look at the history of technology and energy, a question that seems to be belonging to economics, technical linear histories, but instead we can really uncover social histories that we would rarely be able to uncover if we don't look at the same history again from a very different perspective. There is more to say, but I will stop here and leave this on the board. Maybe we can get to talk about it a little bit later. Thank you for listening, and sorry for taking all this time.
Thank you very much, Amr. I'm sorry to cut the time. It's just because I think it might be some curious minds in the room that have some questions. Just before asking around who wants to ask you something, I just have I think it could be very interesting if you can go back to the way you use sources, because the way that Amr presented today is like a very coherent narrative and very like clear and wide and explaining every phenomenon. But I think the novelty of your work is the way you play with sources that people really well know, read a lot and analyzed a lot in a very different way, and you managed to find a new perspective on history with very old sources. So I think it might be useful maybe to explain what are the main sources that you used and the way you read it. Oh, you read them, and you cross. I mean, you cross the analyses in between the two. I mean, the different kind of sources that you used.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very important question. Thank you very much. I think I was very lucky with my topic because I'm looking at something that historians of Egypt didn't look at before: history of technology, history of energy, history of machinery. Um, I had at my disposal a very broad range of archival material that is also publicly accessible. So, for example, I relied on textbooks by veterinary physicians, doctors from the 19th century, where they speak about the epizootic in Egypt in 1840 and 1863. I relied heavily on the proceedings of the British Royal Institute of Civil Engineers in bringing together the story of the uprising from Kau, from Upper Egypt in chapter 9. I happened to find a narrative about the uprising in a book on birds anatomy. A guy who was in Egypt and he liked to draw the bones of birds and bird watching and then drawing that anatomy. And he just happened to be passing across when this thing happened, and he tells us a fascinating story about it's actually from him that I get the word death and vultures. I also relied on things like agricultural and farming newspapers in England. And then a huge range of secondary sources. The work of other historians, for example, was useful for me because it lent itself to my research in different ways. So, for example, Roger Owen talks about the economic history of Egypt in the 19th century, but I'm not interested in the economic question per se. So when he talks about things like the cattle episodic, when he talks about the steam engines that came to Egypt at the time, that becomes for me like raw information. That's primary material for me because it's not questionable. It's not an argument that I want to intervene against. It's just information out there that he speaks about, other historians speak about, and I just triangulate and cross-examine, and here it is. The history of the few steam engines in the age of Muhammad Ali, according to Owen, plus Afaf Marsoud, plus Gillian Alioum, for example. Also, travelogues by people who visited Egypt across the 19th century. For example, in the 1870s, it was very trendy at the time to take the steamer for tourists, take the steamer to Upper Egypt and visit the temples. And on the way, they will stop at Minya. And in Minya, there was one of the most advanced sugar factories in the world. So when the tourists speak about the natives and how lazy they are and these things, it's not interesting to me at all to, to intervene and say something about it along the lines of Orientalism and Said, for example. They speak about the factories, they speak about the chimney, they speak about the way it was because it doesn't exist anymore. Maybe they have illustrations, so that's also primary good materials that I can use without feeling the need to engage with it as a secondary literature in any way. So I guess I guess just lucky with the range of material available because of the different questions.
Thank you for the great lecture. Ahmed Siddiq. I was curious about the source. Is it the proverbial place you cannot sell charcoal to Newcastle? Is it from Newcastle, the source of coal?
Oh, the cool.
And then you've mentioned the usurers, Al Murabin. Are they locals? And how wide was the gap of steam technology transfer? Probably not so wide.
Do you want to collect first?
I think these are three questions. Maybe answer this and then collect. Um, so the Osrors, the one I remember, the Osrors, they were said to be from Greece, which was not considered as part of Europe at the time, and from Syria, uh, and from other places, some of them Egyptians as well. And they tended to proliferate and go into the delta wherever cotton went. And then the story gets more complicated because one of the things that steam technology came to Egypt because of was the cotton ginning factories. Cotton ginning factories were set up by English businessmen and other businessmen from Europe in partnership with Egyptian businessmen too. And what this cotton ginning uh, uh, factories did at the time was lend the peasants who were growing cotton or have some arrangement on taking some of the cotton off their hands because they are going to gin their cotton very fast instead of having it manually, the seed separated from the fabric. So yeah, that's about the question of that. But I can talk about it in much detail if we speak about it on the site. The first question was, I'm sorry. Yeah, the coal. A lot of it came from Newcastle, but Newcastle coal was more expensive than coal from other places in England. And at some point, it was kind of the standard that all coal in Egypt was measured to. So they say this is the quality of this coal, for example, is so and so percent in comparison to Newcastle coal. Rate of technology transfer. As I said, it was very two steps forward, one step back across the 1820s to the 1840s. And then suddenly in the 1860s, a very rapid transition happened between the year 1863 and 66, where 20% of all British steam engines exported anywhere were coming to Egypt. And fossil technology continued to be powered by steam in Egypt across the 19th century. Actually, these are coal imports from the year 1851 to 1911. After 1911, Egypt discovered oil in Suez, and then machines became reliant on oil, and that's a totally different story. Here is where the question of steam power ends. So as you can see, coal imports kept increasing across the years, and 99.9% of that coal was coming from England.
Anybody else have a question? Please do.
Okay. There is a thank you for the for the detailed answer. There is a magnificent mausoleum in the Sahara of the Mamluks in the city of the dead, Sahra el Mamalik, and it's an enigma. I even asked the royal family, but I haven't found any documentation. اسمه مرقد حليم. I wonder if it's connected with this gentleman who is here.
That's a tough
but-
question because we
but,
have
yeah,
several
it
themes.
has been tough for even for the
Yeah.
descendants and the family, but we never know from which part of your effort you get the finest fruit.
Where is it in the?
It's in Meydan El Gawahergi. It will be published in one of my established itineraries and booklets, etc. But Meydan El Gawahergi. So if you are facing Al Azhar Park, turn your back to Al Azhar Park and penetrate the city of the dead as if you were headed to the Muqattam Mountains. You will find a huge Meydan. That's Meydan El Gawahergi. And yeah, it's in Sharia Sultan Ahmed. But that's like it's massive. There's even a little stadium. I joke about it, like, but yeah, where kids play. But it's beautifully lit. That's
The Halim I talk about.
but unmistakable.
Really
It's huge. It's
Yeah.
huge. It dominates the whole area. It's like the largest
But
until
nobody knows anything about
it is the largest mausoleum until you reach الظاهر اسمه ايه فرج بن مرقوق and all of those. So, but of course, this is recent. This is from last century.
Yeah, we have like 3 Halims in the Alawid family across the 19th and 20th century. But this guy was the first. He is Muhammad Ali's son, younger son. But his kind of stronghold was in Shobra. Shobra, as in Shara Shobra, Ahmed Helmi. That was a huge piece of land owned by Halim at the time. I should visit. Thank you.
محمد سالم مؤرخ. كنت بتساءل عن وجود تكنولوجيا البخار قبل في فترة الحملة الفرنسية، لأن الجبرتي قال إن كان في عالم اسمه الفلكي كان عنده آلات كتيرة، والحملة الفرنسية صدرت كل الآلات اللي موجودة عنده. فهل كانت فعلا تكنولوجيا البخار موجودة قبل محمد علي ولا؟
ممكن السؤال التاني بقى معلش.
اوكي. الجبرتي قال ان كان في العالم اسمه الفلكي كان عنده آلات بتعمل بتكنولوجيا مثل البخار. هل ده كان صحيح؟ والحملة الفرنسية لما جم صدروا كل الآلات اللي موجودة عنده والآلات الخاصة بالآلات العلمية اللي موجودة عنده، هل كانت التكنولوجيا البخار دي موجودة أيام المماليك ولا كيف؟
Answer in Arabic. Will it be okay if I answer in Arabic? Okay. هو الفلكي، انا اعرف ان في عالم اسمه محمود الفلكي كان موجود في مصر في القرن 19، وكان من اهم العلماء المصريين من المجموعه اللي اتعلمت في باريس في عشرينيات القرن 19. مش عارف الشخص اللي قال عليه الجبرتي ممكن يكون مهنته الفلكي او شخص تاني، بس عموما انا ما اقدرش اقول لك الحمله الفرنسيه كانت في ايه، بس انا اقدر اجزم بشكل شبه قاطع ان ما كانش فيه محركات بخاريه في مصر قبل محمد علي. ليه؟ المحركات البخاريه اللي كانت بتشتغل في انجلترا في مصانع الغزل والنسيج، الآلة البخارية موجودة في انجلترا من أواخر القرن ال 18، بس فضلت محصورة على انجلترا مش بتخرج منها لحد عشرينيات القرن ال 19. اللي حصل في اللحظة دي إن في صناع فرنسيين راحوا بلاد معينة في انجلترا، خدوا منها صنايعية مكن، ودوهم مدينة صغيرة جنب باريس، وكانوا بيصادروا جوازات السفر بتاعتهم عشان يعملوا ايه هناك في فرنسا؟ يصنعوا آلات بخارية يقدروا يصدروها لبلاد ثانيه في العالم عايزه آلات بخاريه، لان انجلترا لحد سنه 1825 كانت بتمنع اطلاع اي اطراف على تكنولوجيا البخار خارج انجلترا. فقبل اللحظه دي فرنسا ما كانش عندها اعتقد آلات بخاريه بتستخدم في الصناعه ولا اي بلد ثانيه. ممكن اول بلد بعد توصل لها الآلة البخاريه بعد انجلترا كانت بلاد زي مصر والمانيا وفرنسا. بس كانت المشكله بالنسبه لمصر ان ما كانش فيه فحم يشغل الآلات دي، فده اللي خلى عصر محمد علي كله استعانه بالحيوانات اللي بتحرك المكن. كان الحيوانات دي بتتربط في حاجه زي ساقيه 8 تيران بيلفوا حاجه اسمها طنبوره، اللي هي اصلا المحرك البخاري بيلفها بالعمود الفرنسي بتاعه. الحيوانات كانت بتلفها لانه كان عنده التكنولوجيا بتاعه المكن، بس الطاقه القوه المحركه اللي كانت بتحرك المحرك نفسها كانت لازم تشتغل بالفحم. واحنا في مصر ما كناش نعرف يعني ايه فحم قبل محمد علي. محمد علي شخصيا ما كانش عارف يعني ايه فحم. احنا لحد دلوقتي ما نعرفش يعني ايه فحم. الفحم مسكته قبل مره واحده في حياتي معدن تقيل، مش اللي بنحطه على الشيشه. اللي بنحطه على الشيشه ده اللي هو الفحم الحجري، هي الفحم الشجري اسف. فحم نباتي اللي هو بيجي من الشجر اللي بيتفحم. فحم الفوق ده اعتقد ده جاي من معدن الفحم اللي بيبقى في باطن الارض. فحم الشجر. شوف حتى حضرتك انا وانت مش عارفين ايه لا لا انا اسف، بس انا مصدقك، بس اللي اقصده ان اشك جدا ان قبل محمد علي كان في آلات بخاريه في مصر.
كلمة بس يعني just to enlightened about فحم. مش الكلمة العربي ولكن كلمة carbon that's derived actually like that's Latin for coal. That's where it comes from. And then when it's translated as such. مثلا في الروسي إغلارود, so the origin of coal. That's where the word carbon comes from. So whenever you combustible, that's فحم. So it's constructed on that. Just linguistic here.
Does anybody have a question? Yeah, yeah. It's just عشان تسجيل
Okay.
So a quick question about the British, because in railway history, I think things changed a lot when the British take over during the debt committee, but even after the occupation, and they changed the structure of finance. They focused on repaying the debt and not developing the railway itself, and it opens the way for private railways later stage. So I wonder if actually they encouraged something similar in when it comes to tractors or steam engines in agriculture fields. Especially they worked a lot in opening agricultural roadways in different provincial towns in Delta. So did they support in any way spreading the steam technology?
Well, that's a very good question, but I might have a few leads on its answer because I didn't work on the history of steam after 1882 in any detail. But for example, from the little I have seen while looking up the coal statistics after 1882, British irrigation engineers where we have two people who have wrote. One of them is Moncrief, who have wrote this huge volumes on irrigation in Egypt. And what I know they did about steam engines in agriculture was they were pushing for moving from biofuels in steam engines to coal. Because there's something I didn't speak about in the presentation, which is when Khedive Ismail brought the steam engines, he didn't find coal at good prices from England. So what he did, he experimented with burning plant matter inside the furnaces of the steam engines instead of proper coal. So when the British came, they found that a lot of steam engines in Egypt are run on biofuel, which is less efficient and it's not good for the quality of the land, the soil itself, because it takes nutrients when you take that agriculture material. Instead of returning it to the soil, you burn it as fuel. So what they did, they were advocating for using more coal, especially in Upper Egypt. So I guess the indirect answer is, yeah, I think they were pushing for mechanizing agriculture more, especially in Upper Egypt, where the Nile, where the land plateau is higher than the Nile itself. And then mechanization happens through cotton ginning and the cotton industry generally. It's not only about textiles. Thank you.
Yeah, my question is actually pretty much related to this one. I was wondering more broadly about the relation between the arrival of steam machine and industrialization, because you talked about it in the area of Muhammad Ali, but in the case of Ismail Basha, I have the feeling like most of the machines he imported were or maybe you tell me what was the percentage of machines he imported for agricultural work, irrigation, locomotives, and everything, regarding the actual industrial machines. He imported machines for the sugar factories, for example, or but did he? For example, people like Prince Halim, why did he focus on agricultural machines and agricultural steam work and not on developing industrial work? They're related, but I was wondering why this premise was there an actual will to import also steam machines, because you talked about the cotton factories. Were there also was it steam machines imported by Ismail, or was it also foreign capital, because we talk a lot about industrialization after 82 or a little before, in relation with the foreign capital or the cotton trade capital, but I wanted to know if there was something more. And my second question related to it, since our last conversation, I went back a bit to my notes on the Adam Mestian article, and I wanted to ask you, he talks very briefly at the end, something he doesn't really develop, but he talks about the hypothesis of maybe the fact that importing big machinery for the sugar factories, big steam machinery for the sugar factories, is a factor of deindustrialization. So that the industrialization of Egypt was actually blocked from the import of very big machines that demanded needed a big amount of agricultural work. So it stopped a bit the industrialization of the country. I don't know if it's something that can
Yeah, perhaps I should speak more in answering both questions. Perhaps I should speak more about the years of Khedive Ismail. The relationship between industrialization and importing steam technology is not very straightforward, because as I found out in Muhammad Ali's years, which were years of a spectacular production, industrial production, a lot of textile outputs, cannons, big arsenal of ships, and all these things, and they were relying on animal power because they couldn't find coal. So there was a political will to produce things. I wouldn't say he had this preconceived idea of doing industrialization per se, but there was these things. But then, after the collapse of his kind of imperial dream, the steam engine actually came. but to do monoculture. So sugar and cotton are two very important international commodities. When the Civil War happened in the US, in America, cotton became very expensive, and it became very profitable to trade in cotton. Sugar is a totally another story totally. But let me say something first about Ismail. Ismail Bashar wanted to hold monopoly on steam irrigation. He went to great lengths to not let anybody else in the country have control on irrigation using steam. Because he saw it as very intimately related to political power. But he didn't have monopoly on steam ginning. What is a steam ginning of cotton? The cotton looks like a fabric and a seed, and if it's not done automatically in a factory, peasants separate it with their hands, so it takes a lot of time. In the steam ginning factory, which started to proliferate suddenly in the early 1860s across the Delta and created big boom towns in Sharqiya, for example. These were smaller factories imported from Europe and the US. Some of them were manual, some of them were using steam power, and it was all private capital. So Ismail didn't object to steam ginning. It wasn't intimately related to power. So he was trading in cotton, and he had a monopoly on the distribution of water across the country. But then in the early 1870s, he started investing heavily in the production of sugar. And sugar is a totally different story from cotton. White sugar, like the one we have in the spoon that we put in coffee and tea, it can only be produced by using steam technology for industrial, physical, chemical factors. So it's intimately related to big steam investments. And it was a huge investment to the extent that Egypt took a loan that amounted to roughly one or more year of the Egyptian state budget. And it created around it a huge network of infrastructures like railways across Said, brick factories, you name it. It was a huge economy in Upper Middle Egypt in the 1870s, and it's a big story that I don't include in the book. It's in the thesis, but I had to keep it out and turn it into an article because the book otherwise would be too big. But concerning your second question about sugar as deindustrialization, I wouldn't say it is. In a strictly economic, gross sense of the word, it did develop Middle and Upper Egypt. It provided some sorts of industrialization. If people were not brought to work in the factories by corvée labor, they would have been used as hired hands, and hence we will see in Upper Egypt in the 1870s production lines, a capitalist production line, which didn't happen, but it could have happened if it was properly pursued, and the whole project didn't collapse by the late 1870s. I mean the Khedeva sugar factories. So I wouldn't call it deindustrialization. It's actually one of the very few spots across the country in the 1870s that where we can see the real subsumption of labor happening across some spaces. For example, some of the sugar factories witnessed labor strikes. People working in the factories who were brought to work against their will as part of the state labor tax, said we're skilled now. We're not going to provide any labor unless we get paid. And then once they got paid, they turned it into even more sophisticated forms of striking and resisting. They started saying, well, we will not stop working. We will slow down production. Can you imagine? And so I find it hard to think about that kind of sophisticated labor action, which is usually associated with the rise of capitalism in terms of the industrialization. Also, later on, you will find other labor historians like Joel Pinnon, for example, and Ellis Goldberg speaking about the sugar towns in the early 20th century. In Komombo, for example, suddenly 5-6 villages sprout out across Komombo just because a huge sugar company, I think the French or Belgian, did a big facility at the time in that spot. So, you know, industrial society coming to Upper Egypt.
Thank you very much, Amr. Maybe also in relation to this last comment you had, I was also thinking about if you could tell us a bit more about the workers and the engineers running these machines. I think you're interested into also this topic of the laborers. So if you can, tell us also. You mentioned now something, but if you can tell us also more about who were running these machines, what kind of education did they have, and how this developed. And then you promised you would talk about, maybe you didn't have time, so now with a question, the history of the industrial architecture. So if you can maybe also just as a
Okay, yeah, I can say a little bit about it. But yeah, first about the workers, since I have talked about that already with the earlier question, maybe just go over that. So who were running the machines and the factories? Sugar factories, for example, in the 1870s were run by British and French managers generally. And in cooperation with them were the administrators at the different mudiriyas, mudir al-mudiriyah of Gerga, for example, would be overseeing a couple of factories in Gerga. There were technicians, a skilled technician who did the carpenting, the building of the factory itself, the maintenance of the machinery. They also came from England, France, maybe other countries, but it was said in the British press at the time that the Italian and the Greek workers are the worst of the workers who come to Egypt because they drive down the pay scale. And the British and French engineers running the factories at the time were taking roughly 300% the regular pay in their countries. So you would see articles speaking about Egypt, like Dubai, for example. Go to Egypt and take a lot of money and run the factories. And you would hear words like, the steam engines of Her Majesty's go to Egypt and Her Majesty's engineers go after them. Big words like, we are the people distributing technology across the world, and we also manning them. But by the around that time too, there was a technical education started to increase in Egypt. We can think of Ali Mubarak, for example. He was the chief engineer of irrigation in Egypt in the 1870s. Actually, I relied on him a lot as a primary resource, and he was the story of engineering education in Egypt is another big story that I pursue in a different paper in connection to French Saint-Simonian civil engineers, and it goes back to the time of Muhammad Ali and maybe even the French Revolution. And then the workers. Yeah, the transfer of knowledge. The transfer of knowledge between European engineers, but then at some stage later on, as I said in answering one of the questions, Egypt was also experimenting with biofuels. So, for example, the boilers of big sugar factories in Upper Egypt were asked to be redesigned to accommodate biofuel, the refuse of sugar cane, the stuff that remains, the fibers that remains in the sugar cane after it is squeezed. That was used as fuel instead of coal. So the chemical and physical properties of the combustible material which is different than coal, was experimented with in Egypt in connection to an engineer from Ukraine. His name was Casimir Shimios, and he did something between the Egyptians and the British. And so there is a big story of knowledge transfer, but I would say it went a little bit back and forth. And also Egypt was instrumental in the introduction of the Industrial Revolution to the farm in England, because we subsidized the production of the locomobiles when we bought 20% of them for several years. Khedive Ismail, for example, sent a letter to a manufacturer of steam engines in Leeds, in England, telling him to deliver 200 steam engines in 3 months. And the guy replied, "That's impossible. We don't have the capacity." So Khedive Ismail wrote back, "I will send you the money, double your capacity on my account, and just send me the 200 steam engines." So yeah, several ways to look at it, but it's a huge question. Industrial architecture. I can just tell you that one of the very first things that inspired me to work on this project is an article written by Ralph Budenstein on the sugar factories of Khedive Ismail from the viewpoint of archaeological industrial history of site. And it naturally, so this photograph of a factory, for example, comes from his article, Sugar and Iron. And it stayed with me when I was doing analysis on the boilers of the sugar factories. So, for example, maybe I can speak about this a little bit. This is a modified engine used for irrigation. It belongs to a machine that looks like this. It's small. You put it on the bank of the Nile or a canal, and you put agricultural materials that burn on this tray, and the tray takes it inside the furnace, okay? And this happens by means of this little cog that looks like this thing. It looks like two, they run counter to each other, so the material goes inside. So this is something that occurs in the, for example, the periodicals of engineering and such things. But then nobody told us about this patent in the boilers of the sugar factories. I think I'm very proud for discovering this on my own, just from the, just from the designs of the factory. I discovered the same thing, the same patent applied in the sugar factories in Abu al-Waqf in Asyut. So this is as far as I went concerning technical agriculture, architectural, industrial design stuff. But it was really, really useful to look at and to get inspired by Ralph's piece in the first place. Okay. Mm. Okay. Yeah. So this question is about the last chapter in the book, which is about economic thinking related to steam engines and cultural perceptions of the steam engine as infested by creatures of the underworld or afarit, jinn. You know, you know what it means, fairy tale creatures. Um, so when I talked about that thing, al-afarit, I don't exactly remember what stirred my curiosity about it, but Fikri al-Kholi's memoirs, الرحلة, is one of the things that brought the question, that brought it to my attention. So I was close to finishing the project when I found across a couple of pieces of literature from Egypt that there could be this folkloric idea in the past that maybe peasants in the 19th century and later thought about the steam engine as infested by creatures of the underworld. So one of them was Fikri al-Kholis, where he speaks about the industrial accidents in the textile factories in the 1920s. So it was very common for unskilled workers to fall prey to steam engines or to the engines of the textile factories. Maybe they were running on oil at the time. They get caught in the belts. So it was obviously an industrial hazard. Maybe they needed more industrial safety or more training, but they accounted for it as something like this. These machines need the blood of children. If it doesn't get the blood of a child, it will malfunction and eat our comrades. Then in a short story by Yahya Tahar Abdullah describing a village in the 1940s, the peasants gather around a guy coming back to the village with with a machine on his hand, a big one, a grain مطحنة غلال, a grain grain processing machinery, and saying you cannot bring this into our village. Sorry, we know that it needs a sacrifice. It needs a human sacrifice. So it opens up a fascinating question of why the peasants thought about the steam engines as needing human sacrifice. Because I have followed across the monographs the question of things like the uprising in the 1860s, things like the subsumption of corvée labor to modern machinery instead of turning into waged labor. So there could be a very legitimate reason for why they thought about it as infested by Afarit. So in that little chapter I did, I think what I said is the peasants tried to make sense of the steam engine because once it came, it was really spectacularly scary. So, for example, boilers of steam engines, when they explode, they really explode because it works with according to rules of pressure and thermodynamic rules. So, for example, a steam engine in Koisna in Monofia in the year 1906. This is from a newspaper. It exploded at some point because pressure inside the boiler was very high, and it tore into two pieces. The sheer, huge tons, weighing tons, that machine, it tore into two pieces. One piece flew into the air and landed on the other side of the Nile. This is a very scary scene. 30 people died, including most of them women, because it was women who went with the grain to that facility. Another accident happened in Alexandria around the same time. Part of the engine flew in the air, penetrated through the roof of a residential building, and landed on a guy sitting in his chair, and he died along with his family. So it looked really scary at the time. And what I'm trying to say here, it's industrial hazards, but there is also the potential to use it as an analogy to speak about global warming, which I did. This is why I kept it in the book instead of just leaving it in the thesis. It kind of eases me into reconnecting Egypt, that history of technology, to what I wanted to comment on, the history of global warming. Because if we think about it a minute, the peasants in Egypt in the 19th century thinking about this machinery, fossil economy needing human sacrifices. At the moment, we know that as long as we keep the fossil economy running, it will keep claiming human sacrifices, but it still goes on. So, the analogy on some level is really, I would say, pedagogical, and you can use it just as a way to drive your point in the conclusion, I guess.
We have a bit of time, so any other questions? Again? Of course you have.
In the course of your peregrination, have you come across other simple eating ما هي المصطلحات التجارية باليابانية بالنسبة
Yeah, certainly. Other engineers beside Max Ait, you mean? Max Ait was very influential, and he was a very prolific writer. He wrote no less than 10 books. And he speaks about a lot of things. Yeah, there are other engineers. Let me show you some names. There was those two persons, Mr. Bramwell and Dr. Litheby, a chemist and another engineer working or manning something called the Khedive Supreme Sugar Commission in the 1870s. I didn't know a lot of things about them. There was this really influential guy, Mr. Anderson, from the company Easton, Amos and Anderson in England. And that's a company that designed and delivered a lot of the sugar factories to Egypt in the 1870s. And you can find a lot of information about him in the proceedings of the Royal Institute of Civil Engineers. Then the guy from Ukraine, Casimir Shimios, he is a very mysterious figure to me basically because I don't speak Russian. So I couldn't see the Russian archives. Maybe he's well known in Russia, I don't know. But in the British press, he is associated with manufacturers of locomotives in Ipswich, England. So they created something called the Hitchimios patent, which is using biofuels in steam engines, which Egypt was heavily involved in. You also get the names of engineer Fowler, who built the underground in London, and he was hired by Khedive Ismail as a supreme engineer at some point, and he did a survey and a feasibility study on a train connecting Egypt and Sudan. This is well known, it's not new. Then there is another Fowler who was, you can speak about him as the Fowler of Leeds, from Leeds, who was specialized in agricultural appliances of the steam technology. There are the Galloways from the early 19th century, two brothers and their father who were working with Muhammad Ali on industrialization, and they were actually some of the people who really pressed the Basha to look for coal everywhere. What was the other question? Terminology, you can find it in poetry, you can find it in very, very unlikely places. For example, Rifat Tahtawi have a very long poem on Dawabur, the kind of generic steam engine, and he speaks about, he says things like it's faster than light, it's brighter than the sun. One of his students, one of his translation students, I don't remember his name, wrote an eulogy to Said Basha when he died, and he said Said Basha was like a very powerful steamer in a poem, in a traditional poem of, commemorating the departing Basha. Ali Mubarak talked about the steam engines and actually introduced measuring units of bar and how to measure pressure and such things in Alam ad-Din. Some people would say Alam ad-Din is one of the earliest novels in Egypt, but I would classify it as an encyclopedia.
Maybe the last one then, because I don't want to.
Yeah, thank you. That's a very good question. But I'm afraid again that the period I cover is too early to talk about this to answer these questions. But what I know from the time between the 20s and the 70s, when the steam engines came, a lot of European expertise came with them. Uh, I can tell you about a kind of an informal school for technicians created in Shobra on the farms of Halim Basha in the 1860s. Another one was created in El Matana, that's Luxor, I guess, around the same time, because Halim, whom Khedive Ismail confiscated his factories later on, owned a couple of sugar factories in Upper Egypt. So whenever there was a big cluster concentration of steam engines in the country, informal technical schools for teaching Egyptian workers to be specialized in machinery started to come up. In the situation of cotton, you have the phenomena of boom towns rising across the delta all of a sudden in the early 1860s. Zaqaziq, for example, had 5,000 residents in the year 1863. By 1864 or 5, it had 20,000 residents. And Zankalon, which is close to Zaqaziq, at the time had more Egyptian technicians fixing agricultural steam engines more than anywhere else in Egypt. But I think it was a situation rising out of necessity. But also, I didn't come across, stories of Egyptians innovating things in specific ways, because these are the very early years when we have this technology. Maybe later on, I guess. I think there are معلش انا اسف ممكن اوكي سؤال جميل اشكرك عليه. The question is what are the experiences based on what we know about the steam engines in Egypt, about this history, what is it useful for the future? I kind of wanted to talk about this, not this particular question, but the question of future in general in relation to this history. And I had this comment on what does this history of an energy transition to fossil fuels tell us about a transition into renewables on a global scale, I guess. And lessons learned, or what I learned from this history is perhaps two things. We have to be very realistic about it. We shouldn't think about the transition to renewables as something linear that will happen because of engineering expertise. Everything is in a context of capitalist metabolism across the planet. So there are specific structures that everything works within. So for example, if we have very, very advanced solar power, and we do, is going to be used for the production of more commodities, then that's not going to fare well for the planet. Nothing would really radically change. And we should also factor in a transition to renewables. We should factor in the question of contingencies. It's not just what we expect; it's also what we do not know. What we don't know will happen. So from the history we have seen here, a cattle epizootic happened twice in the 19th century because of the tendencies towards the redistribution of land in Egypt led to epizootics. And when COVID-19 happened in 2020, there was something eerily similar to that. Land wasn't redistributed in Egypt, but a lot of experts would say in biology would say that the introduction of monocropping in the tropics have led through a series of events to the transfer of disease from bats to humans in the form of COVID-19. So again, the use of land led to an epidemic this time, not an epizootic. How would that kind of thing, if it is repeated again, how will it interfere with the question of energy and energy transitions? Just by way of example. So I think what I'm trying to comment on here is that energy transitions like the one into fossil fuels and the one out of fossil fuels can be very different and very nonlinear. And by the end of the day, it's about the causes and the series of events specific to every situation. We cannot speak about a generic energy transition as a category for analysis and apply it everywhere and on different technologies.
I think it could be used as a conclusion.
Yes.
Thank you very much for the seminar and wish you the best for the publishing process.
Thank you. Thank you very much.